Title: The Blink of Eternity. Chapter 1. The First Glimpse. The old house sat at the edge of the woods, forgotten by time but not by memory. Its broken windows stared out like unblinking eyes, watching the passing years with a dispassion that unnerved even the bravest souls. The walls, sagging with age, seemed to whisper to those brave enough to come close. A shadow moved within, a flicker of something that shouldn't be there, but nobody ever ventured near enough to confirm. Yet, there I was, standing in front of it. Elias had always been a skeptic, someone who relied on logic to explain everything, even the inexplicable. It wasn't his first time exploring abandoned places, yet today, there was something different about the house, something heavier that made him hesitate. The air around him felt thick, as if the atmosphere itself was charged with an energy he couldn't define. "I've heard the stories," he whispered to himself, feeling foolish. "They're just stories." But stories had a way of taking root, didn't they? Even the most rational person could be swayed by a flicker of the unknown, a hair-raising sensation that you couldn't shake. As he stood there in front of the house, he could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Something wasn't right. He wasn't sure when it happened, but at some point, he had stopped being a simple observer of the house. He had crossed the threshold. Now, the house seemed to pull at him, as though it was aware of his presence, watching him with a cruel patience. It was a feeling unlike any other, a sensation that crawled up his spine, like invisible hands grasping at his bones. Elias stepped into the foyer, the wooden floor groaning under his weight. The air inside was stagnant, dust motes dancing lazily in the narrow slivers of light that pierced through the grime-encrusted windows. The silence was suffocating, punctuated only by the faint creaking of the house settling, as if it were alive and observing him. The air was thick with a smell he couldn't quite place. It wasn't the stale, mouldy odor of decay. It was something deeper, something more unsettling, as though the house had once been alive with joy and laughter. And now, those memories had curdled into something far more sinister. He glanced around, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dimness. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, the once vibrant patterns now a muted reminder of a past long gone. The wallpaper peeled away in places, as if it too wanted to escape this place. A broken chandelier hung from the ceiling, its glass shards scattered across the floor like fragments of forgotten dreams. "Hello?" Elias called, his voice too loud in the oppressive silence. He shook his head, almost laughing at himself. What was he expecting? A response? And then it happened, a faint sound, as if something had shifted in the darkness. He froze, his heart thumping wildly in his chest. It was a whisper, soft and barely audible, but unmistakable, a voice, or at least the semblance of one. "Elias!" His blood turned cold. It was his name, but it wasn't. It was hollow, stretched out like a question, and it wasn't coming from any direction he could identify. He scanned the room, his eyes flicking nervously from corner to corner. Nothing. The silence returned, but this time it felt thicker, as though the very walls were closing in around him. His breath quickened. A shiver ran down his spine, and he instinctively reached for the flashlight in his bag, turning it on to pierce through the darkness. The beam flicked across the dusty walls, illuminating the remnants of forgotten furniture. A chair, a long-abandoned table, and something else, something far worse. He caught a glimpse of it before the beam swept away, a shadowy figure standing in the farthest corner, draped in darkness. He froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He turned back toward the corner, aiming the light at the spot. It was empty now. There was nothing there. "Maybe I'm just tired," he told himself. "I've been hiking all day. My mind is playing tricks on me." But the unease wouldn't go away. It clung to him like a second skin, and with every step deeper into the house, the sense of being watched grew. It wasn't just the house. It was something in the house, something that had waited for years, decades, centuries. It had been waiting for him. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to take another step. The floor creaked beneath his feet again, and he caught sight of an old, tarnished mirror on the far wall. The glass was cracked, but it still held a reflection of sorts, his own, standing alone in the room. But the figure in the reflection wasn't quite right. The eyes were too dark, too hollow, like empty sockets. He jerked back, his heart leaping into his throat. "Just a trick of the light," he repeated to himself, but his voice sounded thin and hollow in the stifling silence. The room seemed to press in on him, the air growing heavier with each passing second. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered again, more clearly this time, and Elias's blood ran cold. It wasn't coming from any direction. It wasn't even coming from a person. It was in his mind, winding through his thoughts like a sickly, intrusive thread. He turned, his flashlight beam sweeping wildly across the room. There was no one. No one in sight. No one standing in the corner. No one watching from the other side of the room. But there was something. The shadow moved again. Only this time, it wasn't an ordinary shadow. It was something far darker, far colder. A presence that stretched impossibly long across the room as though it had no regard for the laws of reality. It snaked across the floor, the walls, and up into the ceiling, twisting and writhing like a sentient thing. Elias took a step back, his breath hitching in his throat. He tried to call out, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was racing, his thoughts scattered in all directions, but none of them made sense. There was no escape, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished, dissipating into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. But the voice remained. "Elias!" The whisper echoed in his ears, a chilling reminder that he was not alone. Not anymore. The house was alive, and it had been waiting for him. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on him. Every creak and groan of the old house seemed amplified, each sound now a sinister whisper, a warning that he was not alone. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, the rhythm steady but laced with fear, urging him to leave, to run. But his feet were frozen to the spot. The flashlight trembled in his hand, its beam shaking as it cast long shadows across the decaying remnants of what had once been a home. For a moment, there was stillness, an unbearable silence that seemed to fill the entire house. Elias tried to steady his breath, forcing himself to look away from the shadows that seemed to writhe and twitch at the edge of his vision. He swallowed hard, trying to convince himself that it was nothing. Just an old house. Nothing to fear. Just a trick of the mind. But the voice, that voice, lingered, an echo in his mind, tugging at the edges of his consciousness. The air felt heavier now, charged with something unseen, something wrong. Without thinking, he began to walk toward the hallway that led deeper into the house, his footsteps hesitant but deliberate. His flashlight cut through the darkness in a narrow beam, illuminating only a few feet ahead. The walls seemed to stretch out endlessly, and the doors on either side stood ajar, revealing rooms that were too still, too quiet. The air in each room felt stale, as if time had frozen within them, leaving behind only memories and decay. As he moved further into the house, the temperature dropped. It wasn't a sudden change, but a gradual chilling descent into coldness. Elias could see his breath now, puffing out in front of him like mist. It felt like the house itself was exhaling, a slow and deliberate breath that seemed to ripple through the air. He reached for the doorknob of a door to his left. His hand brushed against the cold brass, but before he could turn it, he felt something. A sensation like fingers, cold, clammy, and unmistakably alive, brushed against his wrist. His stomach lurched, and he yanked his hand back, his heart leaping into his throat. "Just the wind," he muttered, his voice tight with unease. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were hollow. There was no wind. The house was still, suffocatingly still. His mind raced. The house, the voice, the feeling that something was watching him. He glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting something to appear in the darkened corner of the hallway, but saw nothing. Still, the sensation lingered, heavy on the back of his neck. There was a pull, a magnetic force drawing him toward the far end of the hall, where the shadows seemed even deeper, more suffocating. It was as if the house had eyes, and it was watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. He could feel the weight of its gaze, the pressure building with each step he took. He had to find the source. He had to know what was happening. The door at the end of the hallway loomed ahead, its edges darkened by the shadows. As he drew closer, Elias noticed something peculiar. a faint light flickering beneath the door like the glimmer of a candle. His heart skipped. He hadn't seen a candle when he'd entered, and there hadn't been any signs of life in the house. He was alone. Or was he? The question gnawed at him as he reached for the door. His hand hovered above the handle, hesitating for only a second. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but his body moved before his mind could protest, twisting the knob and pushing the door open. The room beyond was different from the others. It was warmer, the air less stagnant, and there was a strange, almost hypnotic quality to the flickering light. The walls were covered in dark, intricate patterns, symbols that Elias couldn't recognize but instinctively felt were ancient. They seemed to move, shifting just beneath the surface, as though they were alive. A single candle sat in the center of the room, its flame casting an eerie glow on the walls. But it wasn't the candle that caught Elias's attention. No, it was the figure standing just beyond it. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by a hood. He was dressed in dark robes, and his hands were clasped in front of him, holding something small and delicate. Elias couldn't see what it was, but he knew that whatever it wasn't meant for him to see. The figure didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge Elias's presence. But the air in the room thickened, the temperature dropping even further, until Elias could feel the icy tendrils of something unearthly wrapping around his chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs. "Who are you?" Elias whispered, his voice hoarse, the words escaping like a plea. He stepped forward, but his legs felt heavy, as if they were weighed down by an invisible force. The figure slowly raised his head. The hood fell back, revealing a face that sent Elias stumbling back in shock. The face was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to sink into the sockets, like two black holes that swallowed the light. His mouth was stretched in a wide, twisted grin, but there was no warmth in it, only an emptiness that made Elias's stomach churn. And then the man spoke. "You should not have come," he said, his voice cold and measured, like the echo of a memory long forgotten. Elias's throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. The words were trapped inside him, swirling in a storm of panic. What was this? What was happening? The man's grin widened, and Elias could feel it, feel the change in the air, the shift in the very fabric of the house. It was no longer just a building. It was something far darker, far older, and it had been waiting for him. As the man took a step forward, Elias felt a sudden, overwhelming force. His breath came in short gasps, his heart hammering against his ribs, but it was as if his body no longer obeyed him. He was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to scream. The man reached out, his hand stretching toward Elias's chest, and with one swift motion, his cold fingers brushed against Elias's skin. The touch was like ice, sending a jolt of fear straight to his core. And then, everything went dark. The air was thick with a dark, oppressive silence, and when Elias opened his eyes again, he found himself back in the hallway, standing in front of the door. His breath was shallow, his chest heaving, but the house around him was silent once more. Had it been real? The man, the room, the touch. Was it all just a nightmare? Elias's mind was racing, trying to piece together what had happened, but everything felt fragmented, broken, like a shattered mirror that couldn't reflect the truth. He stood there for a moment, trembling, staring at the door as if expecting it to open again, to reveal the figure, to reveal whatever it was that had touched him. But the house was empty. The only sound was his own breathing. He couldn't explain what had just happened, but one thing was certain: the house had noticed him, and it would not let him go. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Forgotten. Elias had no clear memory of how long he had been standing in the room, transfixed by the face in the wall. Time felt like an ancient trick, stretching out until it seemed impossible that any moment had actually passed. He wanted to move, to break free from the invisible grip that held him in place, but his body refused to obey. The air around him was dense, stifling, as if the house itself were alive and inhaling deeply, savoring the fear that had begun to seep from his pores. He didn't know what to expect next, but every inch of his skin screamed in protest. warning him that whatever had been waiting for him here was far worse than anything his mind had yet imagined. A strange, soft sound reached his ears, like the faint rustling of paper. Then, without warning, a high-pitched shriek echoed from the walls. The sound was distorted, fragmented, like a scream cut into pieces and reassembled in ways that made no sense. Elias pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block it out, but it was as though the sound was coming from inside his head. It was inside him now, tearing at the edges of his sanity. The face in the wall, if it could even be called a face, seemed to ripple. The grotesque features warped, as if they were being manipulated by some invisible hand. Its eyes, sunken and endless, stared deeper into Elias's soul, and the grin, the smile, became sharper, its jagged teeth elongating, until it seemed like the very structure of the house was alive with hunger. Elias took a step back, his legs shaky and uncertain, as if he had forgotten how to walk. His mind scrambled for some logical explanation, but there was nothing rational about what he was seeing. The room had become an incubator of terror, a place where reality had broken down and left only fragments of itself behind. The walls were no longer solid. They moved, breathing in time with the pulse in Elias's throat. The floor felt soft, yielding, as though it might collapse beneath him at any moment. He glanced at the door. It stood wide open, but the darkness beyond it now felt like a living, breathing entity. The hallway beyond was a blur of shifting shadows. The candlelight in the next room flickered violently, casting grotesque, fleeting images in the corners of his vision. Before he could act, a whisper, drifted through the room. "Leave now, before it's too late." Elias's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, eyes darting around the room, but there was no one there. The voice had come from nowhere, and yet it felt impossibly close, like it had come from inside his very soul. "Who's there?" he called, his voice thin and trembling, betraying his fear. But the house answered only in silence. The face in the wall had begun to change again. It was stretching, growing, breaking free from the confines of the plaster, as if it had been waiting for this very moment to escape. Elias's breath caught in his chest. The longer he stared, the more he could make out details in the monstrous face. Lines etched into the skin, wrinkles that had not been there before, the eyes narrowing into something more terrifying than mere hollowness. The face was alive. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, snapping him out of his stupor. He whipped around, his pulse racing, panic rising in his throat. The room had gone cold. The chill cut through him like a blade, and for a moment Elias wondered if he had stepped into a different reality entirely. The walls creaked as if the house was stretching and yawning, adjusting to something he could not comprehend. "You're not welcome here," the whisper came again, and this time Elias recognized the voice. It was the voice of the man who had been watching him earlier, the man in the robe, the one who had disappeared without a trace. His voice echoed in Elias's mind, an insistent murmur that swirled like smoke in his thoughts. Elias stumbled backward, instinctively reaching for the handle of the door, but it was locked. The doorknob wouldn't budge. He slammed his shoulder against it, but it wouldn't give. Panic clawed at him. His breath came in ragged gasps, every nerve on fire as the air thickened with a malevolent presence. A low, grinding sound began to emanate from the walls, a noise so deep and unnatural that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. Elias pressed his hands to his ears, but it did nothing to stop the deafening hum that grew louder with each passing second. It was a sound that scraped at the inside of his skull, a sound he could feel vibrating in his bones. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing, like someone, or something, was walking toward him, one agonizing step at a time. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any way out. His heart pounded so loudly that it nearly drowned out the sound of the footsteps, but they were getting closer, closer. He could feel them now. Footsteps that were not just in the room, but within him. They were in his chest, in his breath, in his blood. The shadows in the corners of the room stirred as if they had a life of their own, swirling like smoke, bending and twisting in unnatural patterns. Elias tried to step back, but his legs were unresponsive, heavy, weighed down by a force beyond his control. The air around him crackled with energy, as though the house itself were alive, pulsating, waiting. The figure appeared then. It was no longer just a shadow, no longer just a presence. The man, the one in the robe, stepped into the room, his form materializing from the darkness like some cursed apparition. His face was hidden beneath the hood, but Elias could feel the eyes on him, eyes that pierced through him, hollow and ancient. There was no kindness in those eyes, only an endless, suffocating knowing. "You shouldn't be here," the figure murmured, his voice thick with a kind of unearthly sorrow. The words sent a chill down Elias's spine. He wanted to speak, to ask what was happening, but his mouth was dry, his thoughts tangled in a web of terror. The figure moved closer, his steps soundless on the cold floor. "Do you know what you've awakened?" the figure asked, his voice now a low, ominous whisper. "The house is alive, Elias. It was never meant to be disturbed. Now it will feed." Elias's stomach lurched. He felt his knees buckle beneath him, the weight of dread sinking him to the ground. The figure reached out with long, skeletal fingers, the chill of his touch seeping into Elias's skin, crawling beneath it like ice. He couldn't move. The man's hand hovered inches from his face. "You'll see," the figure whispered. "You'll see it all." And then, the world around Elias began to shift. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Forgotten. Part 2. The figure's hand lingered just above Elias's face, cold as death itself. His breath became shallow, his pulse quickening as the sensation of the figure's presence seemed to suffocate the very air around him. His mind raced, desperate to understand what was happening, but all rational thoughts were swallowed by the oppressive weight of dread that clung to him. A sharp crack split the silence. The walls groaned, as if they too were in pain. The figure, if it could still be called a man, stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, and almost predatory. Elias instinctively recoiled, his back slamming into the cold wall behind him. He gasped as a wave of ice-cold energy washed over him, stealing the warmth from his skin, leaving him hollow. "Don't fight it," the figure murmured, his voice a rasping whisper that seemed to vibrate the air itself. "You've already been touched by it." Elias's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air like a haunting chant, each syllable sinking deeper into his chest. He tried to push himself up, to flee, but his limbs felt paralyzed, as though some invisible force held him in place. The figure's face was still hidden beneath the hood, but Elias could feel its gaze piercing through him, as though it could see everything, his deepest fears, his hidden sins, his most intimate thoughts. His throat tightened, and he fought to swallow the lump of terror that had formed there. "Who are you?" Elias managed to croak, his voice shaking with the weight of his fear. The figure did not respond immediately. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed toward the far corner of the room, where the shadows had begun to stir, shifting like liquid smoke. The air grew heavier, the temperature dropping even further, until Elias could see his breath crystallizing in the cold. "You are in the heart of it now," the figure said, his voice almost gentle, but it carried a malice that was palpable. "This place, it was never meant to be touched by the living. And now you're here. Now you've seen." Elias's stomach turned as he followed the figure's gesture, his eyes drawn to the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to gather and move with a mind of their own. He could hear a faint, whispering sound, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to speak in a language he couldn't comprehend. The walls, once solid, now seemed to pulsate with a life of their own. The wooden beams above creaked and groaned, as though they were under pressure, as though something immense and ancient was shifting beneath the house. Then, something emerged from the shadows. At first, it was barely noticeable, a flicker of movement in the corner of Elias's vision. But as his eyes adjusted, he could see the figure clearly. It was a shape, a mass of darkness and twisted limbs, its body shifting and contorting like a creature from a nightmare. It was large, too large for the room, but somehow it fit, crawling out of the shadows as though it had always been there, waiting. The air grew thicker, more oppressive, as the creature slithered toward Elias. It was featureless at first, but as it moved closer, details began to emerge. The surface of its body was slick, wet, like oil, but it shimmered with a faint ghostly light. Its limbs were elongated, unnaturally so, twisted and gnarled like the roots of an ancient tree. The shape seemed to flicker and distort with every movement, as if it were made of smoke and shadows, unable to maintain any one form. Elias could barely breathe. His eyes were fixed on the creature, his mind struggling to make sense of the impossible horror unfolding before him. "Do you see it now?" the figure whispered, its voice barely audible over the growing noise of the creature. "Do you understand?" Elias opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The creature was so close now, its presence suffocating, its coldness seeping into his very bones. The shadows around it seemed to stretch, reaching toward him like tendrils of darkness. Suddenly, the creature stopped, just inches from Elias. It loomed over him, its body now fully formed. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowing with an eerie, unearthly light. They seemed to pierce through him, as though they could see into the depths of his soul. The creature's mouth opened, a gaping void of darkness that seemed to devour the very light around it. Elias could feel the air vibrating, as if something deep within the house was awakening. A low, rumbling sound began to reverberate through the walls, the floor, the very ground beneath him. The creature's mouth stretched wider, and Elias could see what was inside. An endless swirling mass of blackness, like a bottomless pit. A soundless scream filled his ears, and he could feel the pressure in his chest building, as though the weight of the house itself was collapsing in on him. It was going to consume him. But just as Elias felt he could not bear it any longer, a sudden, sharp crack rang out, echoing through the room. The creature froze, its body jerking in response, as if something unseen had struck it. The whispering murmurs in the shadows died down to a low hum. The figure that had been watching Elias stepped forward, its presence a dark void in the lightless room. The creature recoiled as though it had been wounded, its form flickering erratically. The figure raised a hand, and the creature froze, its body trembling in place. "Enough," the figure said, his voice cold and commanding. For a long moment, the creature remained still, its body hanging suspended in the air. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and Elias felt his breath fog up in front of him, his body shaking uncontrollably. "You were not meant to see this," the figure said softly. "But now you have, and now, you must understand." Elias's chest heaved as he tried to breathe, his heart racing. The shadows had quieted, but the silence was deafening. The creature still lingered in the air, its eyes never leaving Elias's face. And though the figure had commanded it to stop, the creature seemed to wait, as if it were waiting for something. The figure stepped forward, his shadow stretching impossibly long behind him. "The house is a gateway," he said, his voice now low, almost sorrowful, "a bridge between worlds, and you have become part of it." Elias stared at him, barely able to comprehend what he was hearing. His mind reeled, and he could feel the edges of his sanity unraveling, slipping away. Every instinct told him to run, to flee, but he was paralyzed. The house had him now, and somehow it had always been waiting for him. "You cannot leave," the figure whispered. "Not now, not after what you've seen." A chill ran down Elias's spine as the shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, closer. The walls, once solid and familiar, now felt like the maw of a great beast, ready to consume him whole. Chapter 3. Shadows beneath the skin. Elias's breath trembled as the air around him seemed to close in, thick and suffocating. The figure, cloaked in shadow, stepped closer, each movement deliberate, as if drawn to the very pulse of his heart. The creature loomed behind the figure, its dark, writhing form now nearly invisible in the growing dimness. Yet Elias could feel its eyes upon him. Its gaze was an oppressive weight, like something pulling at the very core of his being. His head throbbed with a painful, insistent pulse. He tried to lift his hand to wipe away the sweat trickling down his face, but his limbs felt like lead, frozen in place. His legs trembled beneath him, and every inch of his skin crawled with the sense that he was no longer in control of his body, that it was simply a vessel, a shell waiting to be claimed by the darkness. The figure's voice, soft but unmistakably clear, seemed to slither into Elias's mind like a whisper between thoughts. You cannot escape what you have seen. This house, it holds you now. It holds all of us. For a brief, fleeting moment, Elias considered running. His instincts screamed at him to flee, to break free of whatever this place was, whatever they were, but his feet refused to move. His body betrayed him. What is this place? Elias's voice cracked as the words escaped his lips. He wasn't sure if he wanted to know the answer, or if he feared it would break him in some irreparable way. The figure's lips curled into something almost like a smile, though it wasn't one born of any human warmth. It was a smile of understanding, of inevitable revelation. This place is beyond your understanding. It is a doorway, a threshold between worlds that should never have been crossed. And you, the figure paused, its unseen eyes narrowing. You were always meant to come here, Elias. The words struck him like a blow to the chest, knocking the breath out of him. He couldn't comprehend what he was hearing. Was he being chosen? Or was this some elaborate, twisted fate that had sealed his destiny long before his first breath? No, Elias whispered, shaking his head. His legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to his knees, gasping for air. This can't be real. It's a nightmare, that's all. Just a nightmare. The figure stepped forward, its silhouette growing larger, darker, consuming the faint light in the room. This is more real than anything you've ever known. This is not a dream, Elias. This is your reckoning. He felt something stir within him, a quiet unease that spread like an infection through his thoughts. The house, the creature, the figure, were they some kind of manifestation of his guilt, of his sins? Had he been haunted by something in his past? Or was this some malevolent force drawing him deeper into the void? But before he could think further, a loud thump echoed from behind him, reverberating through the walls. Elias whirled around, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound was followed by a low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards beneath him. The creature had shifted again. It was no longer a shapeless mass in the corner, but something far more tangible. Its form had expanded, stretched outward like something trying to escape from the confines of the room. Elias could hear the creak of wood straining under the weight of it, the unmistakable sound of unnatural growth, of something wrong, something alive that should not have been. A pair of long, spindly limbs shot out from the creature's body, gripping the floor like claws digging into earth. It was a creature of nightmares. Its form was a blur of shifting shadows, but there was something distinctly wrong about the way it moved. The limbs were too long, far too long for the creature's body, their joints twisted and contorted at angles no living being could possess. Elias stumbled backward, his legs shaking, his breath caught in his throat. The thing was coming closer, moving with unsettling precision. And then, something in the air shifted. The temperature dropped, plummeting lower with each passing second. Elias's breath fogged up in front of him as the shadows began to stretch unnaturally toward the creature. They swirled and twisted like a living thing, crawling across the floor, creeping up the walls, reaching for him. His skin prickled with the sense that the shadows weren't just around him. They were inside of him, crawling beneath his skin. No! Elias gasped, trying to push himself back, but his limbs betrayed him once again. He reached for the nearest chair, his hands shaking, his fingers weak. The shadow tendrils twitched, as though sensing his fear, and they coiled in response, like serpents preparing to strike. But then, the figure, the man in the dark cloak, moved with unnerving speed, his shadow flickering as though the room itself couldn't contain his presence. He raised one arm, and Elias saw the creature's limbs freeze mid-motion, as though they were no longer connected to anything. "Stay back," the figure growled. His voice was commanding, colder than Elias had ever heard. For a long moment, everything was still. The house creaked and groaned, but the shadows seemed to obey the figure's command, retreating back into their corners, slithering away like rats afraid of the light. The creature, too, became motionless, its writhing form stilled in place. Elias looked up, eyes wide, too afraid to even speak. The figure, who had been nothing more than an enigma since Elias had first seen him, now stood before him, shrouded in mystery and terror. There was power in his presence, something ancient, something that reached deep into the very foundation of the house. "I told you," the figure said softly, his voice now distant, almost sorrowful. "You are bound to this place. This is no longer just a house. It is something else, something older." Elias could barely make sense of the words. The figure's shadow seemed to deepen as it stretched across the floor, but Elias couldn't take his eyes off the creature, still, unnaturally still before him. The figure's hand rose again, and this time, the house itself seemed to respond. The walls groaned as though alive, and a low hum vibrated through the floor. The creature's form shuddered and distorted once more, twisting in ways Elias could not understand, until the figure spoke again. "There are things here that should never have been touched. The creature you see before you, it is a reflection, a reminder, and you—" The figure turned his gaze to Elias, his eyes gleaming with an unfathomable depth. "You are a part of the reason it exists." Elias's mind swirled. The words sank into him like stones into deep water. He was a part of this. How? Why? The room spun as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. The shadows, which had retreated, now began to pulse, undulating like a living thing, creeping up from the floor, pooling around his feet. Elias tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't obey. His knees buckled and he fell to the ground, his hands bracing him against the cold, unforgiving floor. The whispers returned, louder now, pressing into his skull. He could feel them everywhere. They were inside of him, crawling into his mind. The figure's shadow loomed over him as he whispered softly, "There's nowhere left to run." A wave of dark, twisting fear washed over Elias, and as the shadow enveloped him, he felt the last remnants of his will slip away. All that was left was the darkness. Chapter 3. Shadows Beneath the Skin. Elias's breath trembled as the air around him seemed to close in, thick and suffocating. The figure, cloaked in shadow, stepped closer, each movement deliberate, as if drawn to the very pulse of his heart. The creature loomed behind the figure, its dark, writhing form now nearly invisible in the growing dimness. Yet Elias could feel its eyes upon him. Its gaze was an oppressive weight, like something pulling at the very core of his being. His head throbbed with a painful, insistent pulse. He tried to lift his hand to wipe away the sweat trickling down his face, but his limbs felt like lead, frozen in place. His legs trembled beneath him, and every inch of his skin crawled with the sense that he was no longer in control of his body, that it was simply a vessel, a shell waiting to be claimed by the darkness. The figure's voice, soft but unmistakably clear, seemed to slither into Elias's mind like a whisper between thoughts. "You cannot escape what you have seen. This house, it holds you now. It holds all of us." For a brief, fleeting moment, Elias considered running. His instincts screamed at him to flee, to break free of whatever this place was, whatever they were. But his feet refused to move. His body betrayed him. "What is this place?" Elias's voice cracked as the words escaped his lips. He wasn't sure if he wanted to know the answer, or if he feared it would break him in some irreparable way. The figure's lips curled into something almost like a smile, though it wasn't one born of any human warmth. It was a smile of understanding, of inevitable revelation. "This place is beyond your understanding. It is a doorway, a threshold between worlds that should never have been crossed. And you—" The figure paused, its unseen eyes narrowing. "You were always meant to come here, Elias." The word struck him like a blow to the chest, knocking the breath out of him. He couldn't comprehend what he was hearing. Was he being chosen? Or was this some elaborate, twisted fate that had sealed his destiny long before his first breath? "No," Elias whispered, shaking his head. His legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to his knees, gasping for air. "This can't be real. It's a nightmare, that's all. Just a nightmare." The figure stepped forward, its silhouette growing larger, darker, consuming the faint light in the room. "This is more real than anything you've ever known. This is not a dream, Elias." This is your reckoning. He felt something stir within him, a quiet unease that spread like an infection through his thoughts. The house, the creature, the figure, were they some kind of manifestation of his guilt, of his sins? Had he been haunted by something in his past? Or was this some malevolent force drawing him deeper into the void? But before he could think further, a loud thump echoed from behind him, reverberating through the walls. Elias whirled around, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound was followed by a low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards beneath him. The creature had shifted again. It was no longer a shapeless mass in the corner, but something far more tangible. Its form had expanded, stretched outward like something trying to escape from the confines of the room. Elias could hear the creak of wood straining under the weight of it, the unmistakable sound of unnatural growth, of something wrong, something alive that should not have been. A pair of long, spindly limbs shot out from the creature's body, gripping the floor like claws digging into earth. It was a creature of nightmares. Its form was a blur of shifting shadows, but there was something distinctly wrong about the way it moved. The limbs were too long, far too long for the creature's body, their joints twisted and contorted at angles no living being could possess. Elias stumbled backward, his legs shaking, his breath caught in his throat. The thing was coming closer, moving with unsettling precision. And then, something in the air shifted. The temperature dropped, plummeting lower with each passing second. Elias's breath fogged up in front of him as the shadows began to stretch unnaturally toward the creature. They swirled and twisted like a living thing, crawling across the floor, creeping up the walls, reaching for him. His skin prickled with the sense that the shadows weren't just around him. They were inside of him, crawling beneath his skin. "No!" Elias gasped, trying to push himself back, but his limbs betrayed him once again. He reached for the nearest chair, his hands shaking, his fingers weak. The shadow tendrils twitched, as though sensing his fear, and they coiled in response, like serpents preparing to strike. But then, the figure, the man in the dark cloak, moved with unnerving speed, his shadow flickering as though the room itself couldn't contain his presence. He raised one arm, and Elias saw the creature's limbs freeze mid-motion, as though they were no longer connected to anything. "Stay back," the figure growled. His voice was commanding, colder than Elias had ever heard. For a long moment, everything was still. The house creaked and groaned, but the shadows seemed to obey the figure's command, retreating back into their corners, slithering away like rats afraid of the light. The creature, too, became motionless, its writhing form stilled in place. Elias looked up, eyes wide, too afraid to even speak. The figure, who had been nothing more than an enigma since Elias had first seen him, now stood before him, shrouded in mystery and terror. There was power in his presence, something ancient, something that reached deep into the very foundation of the house. "I told you," the figure said softly, his voice now distant, almost sorrowful. "You are bound to this place. This is no longer just a house. It is something else, something older." Elias could barely make sense of the words. The figure's shadow seemed to deepen as it stretched across the floor, but Elias couldn't take his eyes off the creature. Still, unnaturally still before him, the figure's hand rose again, and this time the house itself seemed to respond. The walls groaned as though alive, and a low hum vibrated through the floor. The creature's form shuddered and distorted once more, twisting in ways Elias could not understand, until the figure spoke again. "There are things here that should never have been touched. The creature you see before you, it is a reflection, a reminder. And you—" The figure turned his gaze to Elias, his eyes gleaming with an unfathomable depth. "You are a part of the reason it exists." Elias's mind swirled. The words sank into him like stones into deep water. He was a part of this. How? Why? The room spun as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. The shadows, which had retreated, now began to pulse, undulating like a living thing, creeping up from the floor, pooling around his feet. Elias tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't obey. His knees buckled and he fell to the ground, his hands bracing him against the cold, unforgiving floor. The whispers returned, louder now, pressing into his skull. He could feel them everywhere. They were inside of him, crawling into his mind. The figure's shadow loomed over him as he whispered softly, "There's nowhere left to run." A wave of dark, twisting fear washed over Elias, and as the shadow enveloped him, he felt the last remnants of his will slip away. All that was left was the darkness. Chapter 4. The eyes beneath the surface. The night was suffocating. A thick, unnerving silence had descended upon the house. The creaking floorboards beneath Adam's feet echoed like a twisted lullaby, their rhythm broken only by the occasional gust of wind that howled through the cracks in the ancient walls. It felt as though the house itself was alive, watching, waiting, its breath heavier with each passing moment. He had tried to ignore the growing sense of unease that had followed him since he first stepped inside, but it was no use. The house was unwelcoming in ways that words failed to describe. No matter how many times he tried to rationalize the strange occurrences, the sensation of being trapped in the grip of something otherworldly gnawed at him, more persistent than any logical explanation could account for. His fingers hovered over the worn edge of the old journal he had found earlier. Its pages yellowed with age, its binding cracked as though it had been read 1,000 times by hands long gone. He hadn't dared open it fully yet. Not after he'd seen the strange marks on its pages, the symbols that seemed to shift and writhe beneath the flickering candlelight. The more he studied them, the more he felt an overwhelming pull. Something ancient, dark, pulling him closer to the truth. But truth was not a luxury he could afford anymore. The visions had intensified, and with them, the whispers. It was as if something had awakened within the walls of this house, something that had been waiting for centuries, waiting for him. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned away from the journal, unable to suppress the growing dread that twisted his gut. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed from the door to the room. Adam's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected anyone. No one had been to the house for years, not since the disappearance of the family that once lived here, a tragedy that the town had long whispered about but never dared speak of openly. Against his better judgment, Adam moved toward the door. The very air around him seemed to thicken, as if the house itself were warning him. He could almost hear the walls whispering, "Don't open it." But curiosity, like a flame licking at the edges of his mind, pushed him forward. He placed his hand on the doorknob. It was cold, far colder than it should have been, as if the door itself had been touched by death. He hesitated for a moment, then twisted the knob. The door creaked open, revealing the hallway beyond, shrouded in shadow. The candles along the walls flickered, casting ghostly shapes that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. The hallway stretched into darkness, its farthest reaches hidden from view. The knock had come from behind him. Adam spun around, heart racing. There was no one there. The room felt colder now, the air thick with something else, something that pressed in on him, a presence far too close for comfort. He could feel it, a looming, suffocating weight that hung in the air. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the room. The room. It was silent now. The knock had faded, but the feeling lingered. His mind screamed at him to leave, to run, to do anything but stand there, rooted to the spot, but his body refused to obey. There was something in the room, something that had been waiting for him. Then a noise, a soft scrape, barely audible over the pounding of his heart. His eyes flicked to the floor beneath the desk, where a small object had shifted. A pen. It had rolled across the floor, its path erratic, as though pushed by an invisible hand. Adam moved towards it, his breath shallow. As he bent down to pick it up, the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening force. The room plunged into darkness. For a moment, Adam stood frozen, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in on him. He could hear the rhythmic thumping of his own heartbeat in his ears, louder than any sound the house had ever made. Then, a faint glow began to illuminate the room, a sickly green light that seemed to come from nowhere yet everywhere at once. It washed over him, casting his shadow on the walls like a dark, twisted silhouette. He turned slowly, his gaze searching the room. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. He could feel something moving in the shadows, something that wasn't quite human, but close enough to make his skin crawl. And then, he saw it. A face. It wasn't just any face. The features were twisted, grotesque, as if they had been stretched and reshaped, the eyes wide and unblinking, filled with an endless depth of despair and hunger. The skin was pale, nearly translucent, and the mouth was slightly open, as if it were about to speak. But it didn't. The face simply stared at him from the far corner of the room, its expression frozen in a silent scream. Adam's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to look away, to escape, but his body refused to move. The face seemed to draw him in, its presence both haunting and suffocating. He could feel it, something ancient, something malicious, crawling beneath his skin, seeping into his thoughts. For a long moment, he stood there, trapped by its gaze. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the face vanished. The room was once again bathed in darkness, the oppressive weight lifting from the air. Adam's legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. He couldn't shake the feeling that the face had never truly left, that it was still watching him, somewhere in the darkness. He reached for the journal again, but as his hand brushed the edges of the cracked leather cover, the floor beneath him creaked. A warning. Something was stirring, something that had been waiting far longer than he could comprehend. The walls seemed to groan in protest, as if they were waking from a long, terrible slumber. But there was no time to think. A low voice, faint but unmistakable, whispered through the darkness. "Do you see?" Chapter 4. The Eyes Beneath the Surface. Part 2. Adam's breath was shallow, his chest rising and falling in erratic gasps as he slowly pushed himself back against the wall. The air around him felt suffocating, heavy, charged with an energy that made his skin prickle. He couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, watching him, pressing in from all sides. He had seen something. That face, the eyes. No, not just the eyes. Something deeper, a presence. The voice that whispered through the darkness, faint but unmistakable, was still echoing in his mind. "Do you see?" He forced himself to stand, legs shaky and weak. The journal, the book that had brought him here, was now lying open on the floor, as though it had been discarded, forgotten in the chaos of the moment. His hands trembled as he reached for it, but before he could close the pages, something made him pause. The symbols on the pages. They were different now. The ink seemed to bleed, the words shifting beneath his touch, contorting in ways that defied logic. The pages, once solid and unmoving, were now alive, alive in a way that twisted Adam's stomach into knots. He could hear it again. The voice. "Do you see the truth?" The words were clearer this time. They slid into his mind like oil, slick and heavy. He felt them coating his thoughts, urging him, pulling him towards something he could barely comprehend. Without thinking, he stood up, the journal still clutched in his hands. His mind was reeling, but there was one thought that stood out among the chaos. "I have to leave." But as he turned to leave the room, the door slammed shut with a violent crash, trapping him inside. His heart skipped a beat, and he whipped around to face the door. The air around him grew colder, the temperature plummeting as though the house itself had turned against him. He tried the doorknob. It was locked. No matter how hard he twisted, it refused to budge. The voice, now louder, more insistent, filled the room. "There's no escape, Adam. Not from the eyes." Adam staggered back, his pulse racing. The walls seemed to close in on him, their surfaces shifting, melting in places, revealing darker depths, blackness that seemed to pull at his very soul. He could hear things in the dark, whispers, like hundreds of voices murmuring in unison, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. A low hum began to vibrate through the air, resonating deep in his chest. It was as though the house itself was humming in harmony with something unseen, something ancient. He stumbled backward, his mind spiraling into panic. No, this isn't real, he thought. But the tremors in the walls, the oppressive weight of the air, the voices, they were too real, too present. The candles on the shelves flickered erratically, casting monstrous shadows that twisted and wriggled in unnatural ways. He could feel them, the eyes, watching him from every corner, from every crevice. They were everywhere now, suffocating him, closing in. He couldn't tell if they were real, or if they were part of his descent into madness. But he could feel them. He could feel them. Their gaze crawling across his skin, into his mind, probing every dark corner of his thoughts. He had to leave. But the door, the windows, the very walls, they all conspired against him. His pulse thrummed in his ears as his mind screamed for escape. But then there was a sound. A soft scrape, barely perceptible, coming from the corner of the room. Adam turned slowly, his eyes darting to the source of the noise. The shadows in the corner seemed to shift, undulating like a living thing. And then, through the shifting darkness, a shape began to form. It was slow at first, just a shadow moving with a fluidity that wasn't natural. But then it solidified into something darker, something far worse than a mere shadow. The face. The same face he had seen before, the one with the hollow staring eyes. But now, it was more than just a face. It was a figure, a silhouette of a man, or something like a man, emerging from the darkness. The features were grotesque, stretched and malformed as though it had been pulled from the depths of a nightmare. The eyes were the worst part, hollow, black, with no end to the abyss inside them. It stepped closer, its movements fluid, too smooth, too unnatural. Adam could feel its presence in his bones, the very air around him thick with the weight of its gaze. The room seemed to warp and bend, the shadows stretching out like fingers, reaching toward him. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come, Adam." The voice was not human. It was a whisper, a low rasp that vibrated through his skull, rattling his mind. The words slithered through the air, wrapping around his thoughts like tendrils of ice. "You shouldn't have come. I didn't know," Adam stammered, his throat tight with fear. "I didn't mean to." "You never do," the figure interrupted, its voice sharp, like glass scraping against stone. "But it was always meant to be. You are mine now." Adam's pulse thundered in his ears. His legs felt weak beneath him, as if the very air was draining his strength. The figure was so close now, its cold breath washing over him, sending shivers down his spine. He could see the dark voids in its eyes, see the endless expanse within them, as though staring into them meant losing himself forever. His vision blurred as panic overtook him. The floor tilted beneath him, and he collapsed, falling to his knees. The walls seemed to be closing in, the darkness pressing tighter, suffocating him. He couldn't breathe. His chest was tight, his heart pounding, his thoughts becoming a chaotic whirl of terror. The figure bent down, its long skeletal fingers reaching for him. It was so close now, so close he could feel its cold touch, like ice against his skin. And then it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "You'll see what's behind the eyes. The truth." The room seemed to spin as Adam's mind shattered, unable to comprehend what was happening. The figure loomed over him, its eyes like endless pits, pulling him deeper, drawing him in. He felt himself falling, spiraling into the dark, lost to the nothingness within the gaze. And then, everything went black. Chapter 6. The Unraveling. The house felt different now, its bones cracked and its structure decaying. But more than that, it seemed to breathe. Adam could feel it in the silence, in the way the walls seemed to pulsate in the dim, flickering light. The once familiar space now stretched unnaturally, warping around him as if the house had become a living, breathing thing. The air was thick and cold, but not the kind of chill that one would expect from the turning of seasons. No, this cold felt like something far older, something that had settled deep into the foundations of this place, rooting itself into the very land beneath. Every step he took was slower than the last. The wooden floorboards creaked under his weight, each sound echoing too loudly in the heavy quiet. His mind was heavy too, burdened with the knowledge that something was terribly wrong. The house was no longer just a house. It was a cage, its walls closing in on him with each passing second. Adam tried to ignore the creeping unease gnawing at him, but it clung to him like a second skin. He couldn't escape the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. He had to push on, to keep moving, to try and make sense of what was happening. As he passed the old staircase leading up to the second floor, his gaze lingered for a moment on the narrow hallway that led to the basement. He shuddered. It had been in the basement that everything had started. That thing, the entity, had found him. It had whispered to him in the dark, promising him things he could never understand, and the moment he heard its voice, everything in his life had begun to unravel. He had tried to run after that first encounter. He had tried to flee, to escape the terror that now seemed to follow him wherever he went. But the house had other plans. He had barely made it out of the basement when the door slammed shut behind him. A great weight pressed on his chest, suffocating him. And when he had turned around, the hallway seemed to stretch forever into an unending darkness. The house had closed off the way he had come, trapping him in this nightmare. Now, standing in the very same hallway where it all began, Adam felt the dread rising again. The shadows clung to the corners of his vision, stretching and shifting as though alive. He had not imagined this. He had seen them. Those dark, serpentine shapes that moved in the periphery of his sight, always just out of reach but never completely gone. A creaking sound startled him. It came from the living room. Adam turned sharply, his pulse quickening as he reached for the nearest door frame, his knuckles white as he gripped the wood. He wasn't alone. He could feel it now, the presence that had followed him through every room, through every hall, creeping into the cracks and corners of his mind. It wasn't just the house. It was the thing that lurked within it. Swallowing his fear, Adam forced himself to move forward, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as though not to disturb the fragile stillness. He had to know. He had to understand what was happening, what had happened to the house, and what that thing wanted from him. As he entered the living room, the temperature dropped suddenly, the air thick with an unnatural chill. He could see his breath misting in the dim light, the only illumination coming from the single, flickering bulb overhead. The walls seemed to press in closer, as though the house itself was trying to squeeze the life out of him. The shadows twisted unnaturally, coiling in on themselves, then unfurling like tendrils, reaching for him. The whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. "Do you see?" Adam froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice was inside his head, threading through his thoughts like an invasive root, burrowing deeper with each passing second. It was the same voice he had heard in the basement, the same cold, disembodied whisper that had stolen the warmth from his blood and left him shivering in fear. His eyes darted around the room, but there was no one there. The silence returned, oppressive and thick, making his ears ring with its absence. His skin crawled as though 1,000 unseen eyes were boring into him. "Do you see the truth?" the voice asked again, this time louder, as though it were standing right behind him, its breath brushing against his ear. "Do you understand?" Adam's breath came faster now, his pulse quickening as his hands shook at his sides. He couldn't run. There was nowhere left to run to. The house had sealed him in, and it knew it. It was playing with him, toying with his sanity. The fear that had been simmering inside him boiled over into something darker, something raw. What did it want from him? The question echoed in his mind, but there was no answer, only the silence. But then, amidst the stillness, he saw it. A shadow flickered in the corner of his vision, moving in jerky, unnatural motions. It was too large to be just a trick of the light, too real to be a figment of his imagination. His eyes followed the movement, and he saw the outline of something, or someone, standing at the edge of the room. The shape was indistinct, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to bleed into the shadows themselves. His stomach churned with revulsion as the figure took a step forward, its form becoming clearer, more defined. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and as it stepped closer, the air around Adam grew even colder. The temperature dropped so rapidly that his teeth began to chatter, and he could feel the sweat on his back turning to ice. The figure did not move like a man, but like something ancient, something that had never known the warmth of life. "Do you remember?" the figure asked, its voice no longer a whisper, but a guttural growl that reverberated in his chest. "You've always been here." Adam's breath caught in his throat, The figure's face was no longer human. Its eyes were two dark, gaping pits, voids that seemed to suck in all the light around them. Its skin, if it could even be called that, was stretched thin and translucent, veins pulsing beneath the surface, as though the thing's very flesh was not of this world. The house was the thing. The house was alive, and it had been waiting for him. "Who are you?" Adam gasped, his voice hoarse, the words barely escaping his throat. "I am your past," the figure replied, its voice a horrible amalgamation of whispers and growls. "I am the promise you made, the price you will pay." The room began to spin, the walls closing in around him as the temperature continued to plummet. His vision blurred as the shadows reached toward him, curling like tendrils, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. He stumbled backward, but his legs were like lead, his feet dragging across the cold floor. The figure took another step forward, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. "You cannot escape, Adam. You cannot run from what you are, what you were always meant to be." Adam's mind fractured under the weight of the words. His past, the house, it was all tied together. The thing in front of him, the house itself, had always known. It had always been waiting for him. "No," Adam whispered, shaking his head as the tears began to well up in his eyes. "No, I don't remember." But it was too late. The shadows wrapped around him, and the room, the house, began to collapse, folding in on itself as reality and nightmare intertwined. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as everything around him, his past, his future, his very soul, was consumed by the darkness. The house had won. Chapter 7. The Cracks Beneath. The house had become a thing of shadows and whispers. It wasn't just the echo of footsteps that lingered in the silence. It was the pulse of something far older than the decaying walls, far older than the rotting floorboards. Something had awakened in the bones of the house, and it wasn't leaving any time soon. Adam could feel it in the marrow of his own bones. The weight of it had settled inside him, like a cold that he couldn't shake, no matter how much he tried to move, to breathe, to run. But there was no running now. Each step he took felt like an act of defiance. His heart beat faster with each creak of the floor beneath him, each whisper that crawled into his ears, each shadow that seemed to stretch farther than it should. The house was stretching too, its halls, its rooms, the very air itself. It was as if it was reshaping itself around him, warping to fit a design he could never fully understand. He had never believed in ghosts, or in demons, or in anything that couldn't be explained by science. But now, every corner he turned whispered otherwise. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. He had tried for days to piece together what had happened to him. The feverish dreams, the hallucinations, the sharp twisting pain in his chest when he closed his eyes and listened to the silence. The thing, the one that had visited him, no, haunted him, in the basement, had left him with more than just fear. It had left him with a truth that he couldn't escape, a truth that had clawed at him from the inside. He could no longer deny that whatever it was, whatever they were, was part of him now. The house was pulling him deeper, closer to its heart, and with every breath he took, he could feel its pulse quickening. He had barely slept in days, each night haunted by fleeting glimpses of the shadow, its shape, its voice, the cold of its presence that never let him go. "Come back," it whispered, so softly at first he wasn't sure if it was his mind playing tricks on him. "Come back to me." He'd heard the voice before, the one that never truly left, but now it was different, more insistent, more real. Adam's eyes flickered toward the open door to the dining room. The air grew thicker, colder, and the house seemed to exhale in a deep, mournful sigh. He had walked past this doorway a dozen times, never truly paying attention. But now, something drew him in, something deep inside his gut that he couldn't ignore. His feet were moving before he could stop them. He wasn't sure what would happen if he went in, if anything at all, but he felt as though he were being compelled, pushed toward it by an invisible hand. The moment he crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just the chill in the air. The room felt wrong, out of place. The table in the center, once covered in dust and age, now gleamed like it was brand new, its surface smooth and unmarred. The chairs were perfectly aligned, as if awaiting a meal that would never come. But the most unsettling thing was the mirror on the far wall, directly opposite the door. It was large, its frame ornate, intricate. Adam hadn't seen it before. He would have remembered something like this, something so out of place in the shabby old house. The mirror was dark, the reflection almost non-existent, as though the glass had been clouded by time and neglect. But then, just as he was about to step closer, something shifted in the reflection. For a moment, he thought he saw himself. But it wasn't quite him. It was as if the mirror was showing him something else. A twisted version of himself, his features distorted, his eyes too wide, too dark, like pools of ink. And then, before he could react, it was gone. His breath caught in his throat. Was it his mind playing tricks on him? The stress, the lack of sleep, it was all wearing him down, wasn't it? He took a step forward, drawn to the mirror despite the creeping dread in his chest. The reflection stared back at him, its surface as still as death. There was nothing, until there was a shift, a slight movement, almost imperceptible at first. But Adam's eyes were locked on it now. The figure in the reflection smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It wasn't anything even remotely resembling a human expression. It was a grin, wide, feral, unnatural. And the eyes, they were staring at him with a depth of knowing, as though they had seen too much, had tasted the bitterness of existence in ways Adam could never comprehend. The figure didn't belong. It was wrong. But it was him. It was Adam. The smile widened. "Come," the voice whispered from the mirror. Impossibly soft, too close. The word lingered in his mind, curling like smoke. "Come closer." His feet were moving before he could stop them. His pulse was thunder in his ears as his breath quickened. But he was paralyzed, locked in place by something far stronger than mere fear. His body, betrayed by the impulse that surged within him, moved toward the mirror, as though some unseen force was pulling him in. His reflection did not move with him. It stayed still, grinning, its eyes never leaving his. "Don't," he whispered to himself, but his voice was barely audible, lost in the suffocating silence that had overtaken the room. "This is wrong. It's just a trick. Just a—" Crash. The mirror shattered. The sound was deafening. Shards of glass flew outward, slicing through the air with a sickening hiss. Adam flinched, throwing his hands up to protect himself, but he was too late. The shards bit into his skin, sharp and cold, sending stabs of pain through his arms and chest. He stumbled backward, eyes wide with shock and fear, as the pieces of glass scattered across the floor like broken promises. But as the last of the glass hit the ground, something more terrifying than the shards themselves began to happen. The reflection was still there. In the center of the shattered mirror, a dark shape began to form, a mass of inky blackness that writhed and pulsed, as though something alive was struggling to emerge. And then, with a sickening wet sound, it did. The creature that emerged from the glass wasn't human. It wasn't anything recognizable. Its form was shifting, constantly moving, like a cloud of shadows made of tendrils and dripping darkness. Its face was a blank canvas, smooth and pale, but there was an outline, a hint of something beneath the surface. It was watching him. Adam's heart skipped a beat, his legs frozen beneath him. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused. The thing in front of him wasn't just an apparition. It was alive, and it had come for him. The shadows surged forward. Chapter 8. The Weight of the Dark. Adam's breath echoed in the silence of the house, too loud, too frantic. The creature, whatever it was, had left no trace but a lingering, suffocating air that weighed down on him. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined it all. The shattered mirror, the shadowy thing in the reflection. It had all seemed so real, but that was the problem. Nothing was real here. The house, the cold walls, the shifting rooms, it was all a tangled web of madness that only seemed to grow tighter, suffocating him from all sides. He wanted to escape, to flee to the outside world where there was sunlight, where there were other people, but the house had twisted itself around him, isolating him further with each passing moment. The hallway stretched ahead, dark and yawning. Adam hesitated at the threshold, his legs trembling, unsure whether he was still standing in the same place he had been before. How long had he been here? An hour? A minute? Time felt distorted here, like the ticking of the clock had lost its meaning. He turned to face the dining room once again, but it was empty. The mirror had vanished, as if it had never existed at all. The room had returned to its previous state, old, forgotten, and coated with dust. The strange energy that had once pulsed through the space was now a distant echo, fading with each breath he took. But his mind didn't deceive him. He had seen it. He had felt it. There was no denying the presence that had stirred the very air around him. No denying the sense of watching eyes that lingered from every corner of the house. The house was alive. A soft, scraping sound echoed from the darkened kitchen, drawing Adam's gaze like a moth to a flame. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder as he took a tentative step forward. His hand hovered near the wall, the chill of the air crawling up his arm. The floorboards creaked in protest, but he didn't care. He had no choice but to move forward. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he couldn't. Something had tethered him here, something that demanded his attention, his presence. He stepped into the kitchen. The air was heavier in here, darker. The shadows clung to the walls like sentient things, drawing closer as if eager to embrace him in their cold, consuming grasp. The dim light from a single bulb overhead flickered erratically, casting long, warped shadows that seemed to reach toward him, trying to pull him into their depths. Adam's gaze flitted to the far corner of the room. There, at the edge of his vision, something moved. He froze. A figure, no, something, stood just beyond the shadowy veil, too still, too silent. Adam's heart thudded painfully in his chest as his eyes strained to make out its shape. It didn't move. It simply stood there, waiting, as if it knew he was watching. The scraping sound resumed. It came from the counter, where a knife, cold, silver, moved by itself. It slid slowly across the stone surface, like a hand too gentle to grasp, but too forceful to ignore. The blade scraped against the stone with a sickening rhythm, a sharp grating sound that made his skin crawl. He couldn't tear his eyes away from it, even though every instinct told him to run. Something about that motion, it was wrong. All wrong. The way the knife slid across the surface as though guided by invisible hands, the slow, deliberate scrape, like a dark ritual. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then the scraping stopped, and the figure in the corner moved. It wasn't human. It was tall, too tall, its body thin and unnaturally long. It swayed slightly, like a shadow being pulled by an unseen wind, its form shifting with an almost liquid-like fluidity. Its skin was pale, translucent, and its limbs were impossibly thin, veins pulsating beneath the surface like something alive and unholy. But it wasn't the figure itself that froze Adam in place. It was its face, or the lack of a face. Where a face should have been, there was only a dark, shifting void. A space where features should have existed, but didn't. It was as though the darkness had consumed it, had eaten it alive, leaving behind only an empty, yawning hole. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just blackness. Then it spoke. The voice was not a voice. It was more like a feeling that crawled into his skull, a cold, invasive whisper that touched the very core of his being. You shouldn't have come. The words were spoken with an air of finality, an inevitability that sent a wave of terror crashing over Adam. His heart hammered in his chest, his legs shaking beneath him. He had to run. He had to, but his body refused to move. It was like being trapped in a nightmare, the kind where you scream, but nothing comes out. The figure reached out, its long fingers extending toward him, each joint cracking as it moved with sickening slowness. Adam tried to turn away, to flee, but his body was no longer his own. His feet were rooted to the spot, the shadows crawling up his legs, pulling him deeper into their grasp. You cannot escape, the voice whispered again, its coldness wrapping around him like chains. This place, this house, it owns you now. It's part of you. Adam screamed, but no sound escaped his throat. Then, in an instant, the world around him went black. Chapter 8. The Weight of the Dark. Part 2. Adam's scream echoed in his ears, but the sound felt distant, like it came from another time, another place, like it belonged to someone else. The world around him dissolved into a vast, suffocating darkness, a void that seemed to swallow everything whole, leaving nothing but the chilling pressure in his chest. His heart pounded against his ribcage, frantic and insistent, but no matter how hard he tried to move, his body remained frozen, encased in the same unyielding grip that had held him in the kitchen. He gasped for air, but the air itself felt thick, as though it were suffused with the weight of the darkness. He opened his eyes, but there was nothing to see. No light, no shadows, nothing. Only an oppressive emptiness that pressed in from all sides, threatening to crush him into nothingness. The void was absolute. Was this it? His mind raced, trying to grasp onto any shred of reality. But all his thoughts were being devoured, consumed by the infinite blackness around him. His body felt as though it were being stretched, pulled, twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The pain was unbearable, but it was dull, like the sensation was coming from somewhere far off, as though it didn't belong to him. And then, a voice. No, voices, whispered through the darkness. At first, they were too faint to understand, like a cacophony of whispers from all directions, coming from deep within the void, from every corner of the space he was trapped in. The words twisted and snarled, blending into each other, a horrid murmur of unintelligible sound. But slowly, the voices became clearer. You cannot run. You are not alone. It knows you, knows your fears. The whispers grew louder, each one slithering into Adam's mind, each syllable sharpening into something sharp, something dangerous. The voices were no longer distant. They were inside his head, crowding his thoughts, drowning him in a cacophony of knowing. They knew everything, every fear, every regret, every secret he had buried deep inside. There was nothing left to hide. The darkness seemed to pulse around him, beating with a rhythm that matched his heart. It was like a living thing, alive with hunger, alive with malice. It was watching him, waiting, and he could feel it. Every hair on his body stood on end. Every instinct screamed at him to run. But where? He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping for some relief, some escape from the nightmare that was consuming him. But all he saw behind his eyelids was the darkness, and behind that darkness, something else, something worse, a face. The shape of it emerged, slow and deliberate, in the abyss of his vision. At first, it was only a smear, a distortion, but then it solidified into a figure. The face was like a mask, its features too symmetrical, too unnatural. Eyes, a nose, a mouth. But there was something wrong with it, so terribly wrong. The eyes were dark, empty, like black voids, sucking in the light, absorbing everything in their path. The mouth was wide, too wide, stretching across the face in a grotesque, unnatural grin. But it wasn't smiling. It was mocking him, taunting him. Its expression was one of malevolent amusement, as though it knew something he didn't, as though it had already won. And then it spoke. You cannot escape. You are part of it now. The words slithered into his ears like poison, dripping with cold malice, and as they reached his mind, he felt them take root, burrowing deep into his psyche. It wasn't just the words. It was the feeling behind them. The feeling that he belonged here, that he was part of this thing, this place, that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he fought, he was trapped. The face leaned closer, and Adam felt the darkness pressing against him, crushing him, suffocating him with its weight. He wanted to scream, to run, but the terror paralyzed him. His legs refused to move, his mouth refused to open. It was as though the very act of resistance was futile. Everything was futile. The figure's lips parted, stretching further than should have been possible, and a voice came from it, low, guttural, filled with ancient wrath. Your soul is ours now, forever. The words hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly, the darkness erupted. His body was ripped from the void, hurled through a torrent of screaming silence, pulled in every direction at once. His skin burned, his chest squeezed as though it were being crushed by 1,000 hands. Every breath he tried to take felt shallow, forced, like the very air around him had turned to ash. He was falling deeper into the abyss, his thoughts shattered, his body twisted in agony. His mind was a blur of incoherent thoughts, of darkness, of terror, of everything, and yet nothing. Nothing made sense anymore. Then a shift, a sudden change. The feeling of falling stopped, and for a moment everything was still. There was no pain, no weight, no fear. But something was wrong. The silence was too perfect, the stillness too complete. Adam opened his eyes. He was no longer in the abyss. He stood in the middle of an empty room, the walls stretching upwards in a dizzying ascent, the ceiling lost in shadow. The floor beneath him was cold, hard stone, and the air smelled stale, like the remains of something that had once been alive. It wasn't the kitchen anymore. It wasn't the house he had been trapped in. This place, this space, was ancient. The air itself felt like it had been here for centuries, untouched by time. The shadows around him writhed, their edges blurring and twisting as though they were alive. It was as if the very fabric of the room was trying to escape, trying to pull itself apart. But Adam wasn't alone. He could feel it, the presence, pressing in around him, watching him from every corner. There were eyes here too, eyes that had no faces, eyes that didn't blink. The darkness was no longer just a void. It had substance, it had weight, and it was hungry. Adam took a hesitant step forward, his breath shallow, his chest tight. His legs felt weak, as though they were made of stone. But he couldn't stop moving. He couldn't stop walking toward the source of the oppressive silence, the source of the unholy presence that clung to the walls like a curse. And then he saw it. In the farthest corner of the room there was a door. It was old, ancient even, but it was real. It was something, and through that door, Adam could feel it, feel the promise of escape. He rushed forward, his heart racing, his breath quickened, the sound of it deafening in the silence. But just as his hand reached for the doorknob, the whisper came again. "You cannot leave, not yet." And then, the door slammed shut in his face. Chapter 9. The Void Beckons. Adam stood frozen before the door, his hand trembling on the cold, rusted doorknob. The whisper, low, guttural, and unmistakably alive, slithered through the darkness, wrapping around him like an invisible chain. "You cannot leave. Not yet." The words echoed in his mind long after they had passed, lingering like an oppressive fog, making it impossible to think clearly. His heart pounded in his chest, thundering against his ribs. The room around him seemed to shrink with every breath he took. The darkness, ever present and heavy, pressed in from all sides, suffocating him with its weight. He tried to pull away from the door, but his feet felt as though they were bound to the floor. The cold stone beneath him felt alive, pulsing with an unnatural energy. An energy that seemed to resonate with the very core of his being. His mind raced. He needed to get out. He had to get out. But where? A flicker of movement caught his eye. The shadows. They weren't just swirling around the edges of the room. They were watching him, shifting with a strange sentience, as though they knew exactly what he was thinking. And in that moment, he realized something that sent a chill down his spine. He wasn't alone in the room. The presence, the one he had been feeling ever since the darkness had consumed him, was not just a vague sensation. It was tangible now. Solid. Something was in the room with him. Something alive, but not human. Not even close. The air grew colder still. The chill seeping into his very bones. He could see his breath now, hanging in the air like a cloud of frost. His hands shook, but it wasn't just fear anymore. It was something deeper, something primal. Instinct. The shadows in the corners of the room writhed, distorting into shapes that didn't belong in any world he knew. They twisted and stretched, elongating into monstrous figures, their eyes gleaming like black pits, voids that sucked in the light. The shadows seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with an unnatural rhythm, a heartbeat. It was then that Adam heard it, a low, guttural growl. It rumbled from the darkness, vibrating through the very air. A sound so primal, so deep, that it felt like it came from the earth itself. Adam's blood turned to ice. Then, a whisper, this one even closer, as though it was right beside him. You should have stayed away. The voice wasn't human. It was something ancient, something old, older than the house, older than the room, older than anything Adam had ever known. It was a voice that spoke not in words but in feelings. It clawed at his mind, scratching at the edges of his consciousness, pushing him closer to the brink of madness. He could feel it now, this thing, this presence, seeping into his thoughts. It was reaching into his deepest fears, his darkest secrets, and pulling them to the surface. It knew him. It knew everything about him, and it hated him. His legs felt weak, but his body moved of its own accord, stepping away from the door, retreating back into the center of the room. He couldn't explain why. He couldn't explain anything anymore. All he could feel was the crushing weight of the darkness, the suffocating pressure of being trapped in a place that was not bound by time or reason. He was nothing here. A shadow, a ghost. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were a cacophony, a maddening choir of voices speaking in unison, clawing at the corners of his mind. You cannot escape. You will never leave. You are ours now. The words, the voices, they fused into one, a single entity, an intelligence, ancient and hungry. It had no form, no body, but it was here, and it was real. Adam stumbled backward, his eyes wide, his breath ragged. The walls of the room seemed to close in on him, the space shrinking as if the very air was being squeezed from his lungs. The shadows, those horrible writhing shapes, were moving toward him now, their edges sharp, jagged like claws. They reached out for him, their cold touch brushing against his skin, sending ripples of icy terror through his veins. Please, Adam whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible over the howling wind of his panic. Please, just let me go. Just let me leave. But there was no mercy in the air. No voice of reason, no kindness. Only the cold, implacable dark. In a frenzy, Adam spun toward the door once more, his hand desperate to grasp the handle. It was his only hope, his only chance. But as his fingers brushed the cold metal, a sudden jolt of pain shot through his arm, a searing electric burn that made him cry out in agony. The door wasn't just locked. It was alive, the knob twisted, a grotesque movement of its own, as if it were a living thing, rejecting him, pulling away. The door itself shuddered violently as though something on the other side was pushing back, fighting him. But there was no one there, only the shadows, stretching toward him like a vast, unholy tide. Adam's breath was coming in ragged gasps. His chest felt tight, as though his lungs were being crushed by some unseen force. His head swam with dizziness, his thoughts muddled and incoherent. He could feel the darkness closing in on him, crawling under his skin, reaching into his soul. Then, in the thick, oppressive silence that followed, a sound, small, insignificant, yet so terribly clear. A faint knock, knock, knock. It came from behind the door. Adam's heart stopped. The sound wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the rhythm of the shadows, the pulse of the void. This sound, it was different. It was real, human. Help! Me! The whisper was barely audible, almost lost beneath the thudding of Adam's heart in his ears. But it was there, a voice, a plea, someone, something, reaching out for him from the other side of the door. And then, the door cracked open. Just a sliver, just enough for the darkness to spill through. And as it did, something else followed. Adam's body froze, his legs unable to move as the door creaked open wider, the faint light from the outside world trickling in, along with something much darker, something that had been hiding behind the threshold for what seemed like an eternity. A face that was not human, not even close. The eyes were too wide, too vacant, and the mouth, too stretched, too wide, split across its face in an unsettling grin. The face that had haunted Adam's dreams, his fears, stood before him now. But it was no longer a mask, no longer a trick of the mind. It was real, and it was hungry. The face leaned closer, its grin widening impossibly. You shouldn't have opened the door. Chapter 10. The Other Side. Adam's eyes were locked on the face before him, the twisted grin stretching wider with every breath he took. It was as though the figure could taste his fear, savoring it like a delicacy. The face, it, was no longer confined to the shadows. It had crossed the threshold, crawling into the dim light that barely illuminated the room. He wanted to scream, but his voice was caught somewhere in his throat, lodged in the pit of his stomach where fear had twisted and coiled into something solid, something real. His body refused to move. The paralysis of terror gripped him like chains, heavy and inescapable. The face tilted slightly, an unsettling creak coming from its neck, as if the joints were made of brittle wood or stone, unable to move with any fluidity. Its eyes, those wide, hollow orbs, blinked slowly, too slowly. They focused on him with a strange, predatory intent, like a spider waiting for its prey to make a fatal mistake. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice, or rather the sound of it, wasn't one voice at all. It was many, a chorus of whispers layered over each other, all slipping in and out of his comprehension like a fevered dream. But they were all saying the same thing. "You've opened the door!" Adam stumbled backward, his legs finally obeying his frantic desire to flee, but the air seemed to grow thicker, suffocating him, pressing in from all sides. The shadows that had been retreating now surged forward, as if eager to devour him whole, and that face, it didn't stop. It followed him. "You let it in." The words repeated themselves, reverberating in his mind like a drumbeat. Let it in, let it in. He couldn't breathe. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in, crushing his ribs with every shallow gasp he managed to draw. The floor beneath his feet seemed to shift, to pulse in rhythm with the horrors that were unfolding before him. The darkness, once merely a backdrop to his terror, was now alive, moving, breathing, growing. The door, barely ajar, seemed to mock him now, as if there was no way to escape. But Adam didn't stop. He ran. The house, the room, shifted with him, the walls stretching and contracting like a living, breathing thing. The ground beneath him felt soft, yielding, like it was trying to swallow his every step. He couldn't see. He couldn't think. The only thing that kept him moving was the gut-wrenching primal need to escape. Behind him, the face was still there, following, closer. With each step, Adam's mind fragmented further, each whisper and hiss from the shadows more disorienting than the last. He could hear them, voices, low and indistinct, crawling along the edges of his thoughts. Some were pleading with him, some were cursing him, some were begging him to stay. He didn't know what they wanted. He didn't know if he could even trust his own mind anymore. "You're not leaving, Adam." The voice came from somewhere behind him, and yet it wasn't the same voice. This was deeper, more guttural, and it slithered into his ears like a snake coiling around his skull. He whirled, but the room was empty. There was no one there, just the twisted remnants of the shadows that had been chasing him. The air was suffocating, pulling him in, drowning him in its pressure. The only thing real now was the sense of wrongness, the feeling that something vital, something essential, had been ripped away. It wasn't just the house that was alive. It was the very air itself, the space around him, the pulse of the universe, and it had turned against him. He ran harder, but there was nowhere to go. The hallway ahead twisted in on itself, the floorboards groaning beneath his feet as though they were reaching up to grab him, pulling him deeper into the house. There were no windows, no doors. It was as though the house itself had swallowed the outside world, trapping him within a labyrinth that shifted and bent with every movement. The whispers rose louder, all of them now, all at once. "Come back. It's too late to leave. We know what you've done." Adam could feel his sanity slipping away, as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling with each passing second. He felt the cold fingers of panic squeezing his chest, compressing his heart. His breath came in ragged gasps now. Sweat dripped from his brow, his hands slick with fear. And then, finally, the darkness claimed him. It wasn't like falling asleep or passing out. It wasn't even like losing consciousness. It was as though the world around him simply vanished, slipping into nothingness. The hallway, the house, everything disappeared as though it had never existed. He was floating now, lost in an endless expanse of black, the whispers fading to a low hum in the distance. There was no ground beneath him, no walls to press against. He could still feel the oppressive weight of something watching, but it was distant now, far away, and yet so close. His head spun as his mind tried desperately to grasp something, anything, to hold on to. And then he saw it. In the distance, barely visible against the void, was a faint light. It pulsed, faint and fragile, like the dying embers of a fire. The light drew him in, pulling him toward it as though it were the only thing that mattered. He didn't know why. He didn't know if it was the right thing to do, but instinctively he reached out, pushing himself forward through the empty space. The closer he got, the brighter the light became, until it was all that he could see. It surrounded him, bathing him in a warm glow that felt wrong, out of place in the endless blackness. And then he heard it again, the voice. You shouldn't have come. It was soft this time, almost affectionate, as though it knew something Adam didn't, as though it had been waiting for him. Before Adam could react, the light flickered and distorted, a ripple running through its surface like a stone tossed into water. The air around him crackled with an unnatural energy. The warmth from the light turned cold, biting as the whispers intensified once more. Then the light exploded, not in brightness, but in nothingness. In an instant, Adam was plunged back into darkness, deeper than before. The pull of the void was unbearable now, and he couldn't tell up from down, left from right. It was as though everything had been consumed. And then the voice returned, closer this time, inside his head. This is where you belong, Adam. This is where you'll stay. The house had won.